Happy Monday. How's it going, everybody?
It's going well. It's good to be here from afar.
From afar.
And
Uh,
welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you. Very happy to
thank-
be here.
yeah, it's good to see you. So, Matt, where are you at right now?
I am still in Paris, but
Still in Paris.
next Monday I'll be back in Utah. So
Back in nice. Well, good to have you back. And Jessica, where are you based out of?
I'm in Salt Lake area right now, but I'm moving to Santa Cruz next week. So I'll
Oh,
be Californian as of
nice.
next week.
yeah,
Yeah,
it sounds like a cultural shift.
excited. Big cultural shift.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
sure. My name is Jessica Talisman. I'm a senior taxonomist, ontologist, and an information architect. I currently work at Pluralsight and have 25 years of experience working in the taxonomy world. I have a master's in information science and library science, and I'm kind of a geek and a nerd and love data, but probably a different lens than most data science folk.
Really cool. And I gotta confess immediately, I know nothing about taxonomy, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show. We had a good chat a month or so ago, and I felt like it
Yeah.
was one of these topics that I see talked about a lot, and I don't know anything about it. So help educate us. What is a taxonomy? How should we think about taxonomies?
Taxonomy is a structure of words or terms, and they're organized. Normally, we recognize them as a hierarchical organizational structure. They can be polyhierarchies. Some people identify it as a taxonomy, as a controlled vocabulary. But most of us participated in the activity, which takes on a whole new lens in Utah of the family tree when you're in second or third grade. And having to draw your family tree and understand how that works. Or the animal kingdom's another one that's used often.
Tell me a bit more about this notion of polytaxonomy. I think I kind of have a grasp, but I'm certainly no expert. So I'm curious to hear your take on
So,
that.
like a polyhierarchy is where you have several different large concepts. For example, like in a taxonomy, you might have temporal and spatial data, and that would be one portion of that polyhierarchy. And another one might be conceptual or topic based. They all live together within one structure. So rather than it being more of a flat, continuous structure, you will have multiple segues. So it's more holistic. I would say most enterprise taxonomies that represent an entire business would take the shape of a polyhierarchy. So
Yeah, in a professional context, I mean, we both actually worked in online retail. In fact, we have
yes,
some kind of
we did.
overlapping experiences.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, back, I was not like anything like a taxonomist, but I was doing data science work at the time. And this became a big issue because you would often have items that could reasonably be classified in multiple ways, and yet they would have to land in one place on the website. And so, from the perspective of making recommendations and stuff, this was a problem that we were very, very interested in at the time.
Yeah, and in that similar e-commerce type experience, I think that those can be the most dynamic and complex when your front end really relies on the taxonomy. Um, Going back to the family tree example, you might have siblings underneath a parent. So a parent concept, and we might say furniture. And you'd say sofas and couches might be adjacent to one another under furniture. But then sofas cannot be a child of couches. So one of the biggest risks, especially in taxonomy, is that you can create recursive loops because your sister can't be your mother. This is my example. Can your sister be your grandmother? It follows basic concepts where you create clashes and loops when and those recursive loops, it's self-referential. And then you end up in the situation of playing Jenga with your taxonomy because you're then having to create backlinks, redirects to try to fix it on the front end. And that's how it manifests itself.
Interesting. I imagine this might get a bit messy.
Yeah, it's very messy. And there's also the misnomer, and a lot of mistakes in taxonomies can often occur because there's this concept that you can only have a one-to-one relationship with data. In taxonomy, it doesn't scale very well if you can only have one-to-one. Because as you said, Matt, there can be multiple relationships.
Yeah, and even, very different ways of sort of parsing things. So, for example, one of the problems we were interested in, which I suspect you were interested in as well, was style classification. So suppose I'm not actually interested in couches per se. Suppose I'm interested in mid-century modern. So you can actually create an entirely different taxonomy based on styles or based on time periods or based on artistic movements. And then the question is, okay, how do you manage that overlap, for example?
Attributes.
Yes.
Attribute taxonomies. Yes. So which can be massive, and sometimes those attribute value pairings can be larger than the taxonomy itself.
Oh, interesting. What's an attribute value pairing?
So attributes are descriptors, and attributes and properties can be interchangeable. And so to Matt's example, you might have mid-century modern. That's a style. So style and then the value, so the attribute style, and the values would be the types of styles. So you can think of mid-century modern, arts and crafts, and you'd have all the different manifestations or representations of those. Or colors. Colors is a very, very common one, or brands. If you have packs of things or multi-packs, you might represent how many, or wattages of light bulbs. It can go pretty deep. Within the skills space where I currently work, you might have levels, you might have course style, sort of an ed tech, you have different values to represent the types of courses someone might be watching or wanting to find. So it works internal and external. And that's what's super interesting, is it's super holistic and powerful, because it not only powers the front end of a customer facing site, but it also powers the inside of an organization so people can find things.
Well, and also, I mean, it's very, very important for recommenders from the data science side, which I feel like recommenders were really hot maybe 7 years ago, but they're no less relevant now. I mean, anyone working in e-commerce or any kind of consumer sales is going to care a lot about recommendations. And so from your perspective as a taxonomist, what is something that data scientists should know about taxonomy that maybe they don't know, or about attributes, or both?
There's I think because in the data science field and data engineering, because there isn't a lot of knowledge about the information science space or library and information science space, it's a whole nother process. It's existed for centuries. The idea of classification hierarchies, how we organize information, cataloging. So I'd say librarians and information scientists have it down pat. And data scientists want to be able to wrap their arms around every single problem in an organization, which includes taxonomy. And there's some hubris there, because you have subject matter experts in place, or people who specialize in certain areas for a reason.
Right.
And so the biggest issue is, and this is the trend I'm seeing now, the idea of automating with AI and ML the creation of a taxonomy. And there's the base issue that those models, those algorithms, you have to train those. So, and every organization's taxonomy is like a fingerprint, a digital fingerprint. So humans have to be in the loop in creating that initial corpus or taxonomy. And then that taxonomy, or these taxonomies, can be enriched with ML and AI thereafter. But there's that essential base layer that's necessary, and that it's done correctly, and it validates against standards, ISOs that sort of govern the organization of information. Because garbage in, garbage out, dirty data sucks.
For sure. So it's not as simple as just throwing like k-means clustering at a data set and coming up with your taxonomy like that.
There has to be humans in the loop, because how can we trust that machines or algorithms are going to absolutely capture the idiosyncrasies and the nuances of a particular organization?
Yep.
What an organization sells, what they represent, what their values are, what their priorities are. And so organizing information and applying attributes to help to draw those nuances out and be more specific or granular when necessary is critical for AI and ML to work.
Mm.
And this comment about data scientists and to some extent data engineers being very arrogant is, unfortunately, that really resonates.
Well, Matt and I are among the most arrogant people in the world.
No,
Yeah, for sure.
this is quite possible.
So,
but no, I mean,
kidding.
Yeah. No, it's the misappropriation of terms.
Yeah.
Is one thing.
Mhm.
People will say, don't battle about the word, about words. But when we start to conflate and confuse, and there are tasks that involve the organization or structuring of information and information architecture, it does get mighty confusing what classification means in one context versus classification in another. Data catalog is one that's pretty hot right now. How we
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's a data catalog?
Data catalog can also be seen as a business glossary. So it should be a controlled vocabulary that's disambiguated and defined. I'm more of a stickler for this because often I'll see data catalogs where there are values or terms that are mapped within observability platforms or data governance platforms or data management platforms, and in schemas, other or miscellaneous, MISC period. And I'll just give props to my mom. She doesn't know much about what I do, but this is the one thing she connected with, which is, why would you assign it to a category called miscellaneous or other? Because to me, that means you really don't care about it. If you can't put it in a meaningful place, you don't care. And so data catalogs are meant to drive the organization, but also bring the organization together into a common vocabulary, a common reference point, so that if you request data, ETL and ELT processes, they can be complete and accurate. You can actually receive the data that you request, and in turn, you can send data that you create.
Yeah, and this is a lot of the work that data engineers do, frankly, as well. So, for example, increasingly, I mean, this has always been the case to some extent, but I think we're seeing it more and more now, where data engineers are expected to ingest either semi-structured or unstructured data, and then exactly as you're saying, like categorize it. And yet, on some level, it's not really the engineer's job to come up with the categories, right? They're meant to implement the pipelines that actually categorize the data, but there has to be a process to make sense of the categorization, or you're just gonna have a huge mess.
Even with image training, right? If you're training on images, you're probably going to give them some, object identification or something like that. But I don't know who comes up with those terms, right? Is that just somebody like Matt or me, or is that somebody like yourself, Jessica, or is it some random person you pick out of the hallway?
Yeah, often I see people that are assigned titles like data steward, and that person is that person's responsible for creating the data catalog, but there has to be the translation from, say, snake case into actual English words. And you'll see a data catalog that's just populated with SQL or Postgres table names or column names. And I'm not sure how that helps people, because if you're trying to speak to the entire organization and you have automated processes, someone from marketing or sales that doesn't work in relational databases, they're not going to understand. And so there's the human element. You want to make this useful for everyone, not just data science. And so there's this kind of fiefdom building that I see where it's like it's like you have the gold key, or, you know, the Lord of the Rings reference, just that you have, it's my precious. And so you guard it. But does that ultimately serve the rest of the organization? There should be governance, but you also have to relate it to all different types of people in all different areas of business in order for it to drive value.
Well, and going back to the e-commerce example, I mean, language is still what humans use to look for things, right? And so those categories really do matter, because not only are they going to affect what happens in searches,
Mm-hmm.
but also presumably they're going to affect different like text buttons that pop up for a selection of categories. So am I going to see something like mid-century modern, which is a very well-known term for a particular style of furniture? I'm going to see something that makes no sense to me. And I think this is a big issue, not just for e-commerce, but like any company that partners with other companies is going to have to communicate using language and using classifications.
Just got kind of a related question here too from Guy Thompson. I'm sure we can take some questions midway through. Already getting quite a few good ones. Guy asks, does approaching taxonomy from a different language have any effect on developing a taxonomy, or is there an agreed upon approach?
That's interesting because there can also be different cultural interpretations of words. There's the lost in translation issue, but that's where ontologies come in. So ontologies really structure and define the relationships between things. So you take the taxonomy out of the hierarchical structure, it can become a thesaurus with just a basic application defining, meaning that you're creating a schema to define that hierarchy, but within the alignment and mapping of an ontology, you can build in globalization and localization into your schemas so that becomes automated and helps your data to be more extensible and translatable. And that's fun. And there are always going to be funny little, just where even with the best intentions, labels don't match. Language doesn't match entirely. There might be words in one language for to identify something or define something, and it doesn't exist in another language. English is the hardest.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Why?
English is a hard language to learn for non-native speakers, and we don't gender. We don't apply genders to our words. And the way that we conjugate is a little bit different. And there can be one word, and we have many of these. So you take the word, my example is board, but the word board, as in like, if you have a board, and this actually is an e-commerce, what if you have like a messaging board or a bulletin board? Or if you're bored, which would be an attribute, like I'm bored, like let's get with it. Or I sit on a board, I participate in a board. Like it can mean so many, that one word can hold so many different meanings. So you get into hyponyms and hypernyms. So that's what it's called in the linguistics area.
Interesting. Hey, Matt, did you know this stuff when you were trying to
go? No. I was just getting started on this project. I didn't get very far down the rabbit hole, I'll be honest.
It's awesome.
Not at all.
And it's funny because I'll often see like job postings, how an organization's doing, on LinkedIn, all of a sudden there's towards the end of a quarter, the beginning of a new quarter, that's when you see like a huge rush. It's like their quarterlies, businesses quarterlies come in and they realize, oh crap, we need a taxonomist because the data is a mess. It seems to be like the last stopgap measure.
Interesting. Got another question here from Val Goldine. Hey, what's up, Val? Actually hung out with him in London last week. He asks, master data management, ? I'm imagining that he's asking about how taxonomies fit into master data management, but tell us more.
So again, going back to controlled vocabularies and alignment, but with master data management, you can create crosswalks. And that's something that information scientists are very proficient with. If you guys are you guys familiar with crosswalks?
No.
English. Here we go. Okay, so I walk across a crosswalk, but what
Exactly.
else is a crosswalk?
You can find this in the government space. They publish crosswalks, which are schemas or in master data management, transformers that map using a schema the values of one domain to another, to another, to another, so that you can help to facilitate the transforms so that they all line up and roll up into one global concept for what that field is. Like one person might call it name, one person might call it title. Um, there can be many different names for one thing within an organization. So the idea is going through this process. And I think that's part of the information science. Like librarians and information scientists are super patient. And it's very brainy. And the types of skills and skill sets and the types of processes that have worked for centuries are helping to align and create that global vocabulary. And crosswalks is one translation or way to work collaboratively in collecting everyone's values for a single field and mapping them across. And so master data management is both controlled vocabulary and crosswalks, schema alignment.
Interesting. Yeah, I was talking to somebody in Australia about this a few weeks ago, and they're asking for MDM and data quality. Should we what type of data engineer should we hire for this? And I thought, well, I don't know that that's the right way of thinking about it. I think you're going to be in a world of hurt if you take that approach. And it's like maybe somebody. It was after we talked actually. I thought maybe somebody from a library sciences background might actually be your best fit for this kind of thing, because they're trained to look at these types of data in a certain way, whereas a data engineer would probably colossally screw it up and then have a job posting for a taxonomist later down the road. So
Exactly. And something that I'm running into more and more is there are these established standards. And if you look at something like in the EU, the passage of the green taxonomy, that's a huge deal. It's the law. If you are a business and you go public, you IPO, you have to submit your taxonomy to the SEC. So it truly is like a fingerprint because it describes your business, the types of data that you collect and hold, and it represents those can map to different values within different compliance organizations. Like if you think of the nice NIST framework and the nice NIST taxonomy, when you have classification in terms of like classified or PII information, there's an established protocol, schema, standard framework for representing those values. From a legal perspective, GDPR, it's taxonomy.
interesting. I never thought of it that way, actually. That's fascinating. David Mertz. What's up, David? Good to see you here. Yes, do you find ML clustering algorithms to be a useful adjunct to human-driven taxonomic categories? Get tripped up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have been in positions where that is the starting place for actually building a taxonomy, as I am given ML clustering output, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 terms, and then you boil that down, you reconcile, and you're able to create a clean taxonomy. Maybe that those 10, 12,000 become 2,000. And that's your controlled vocabulary. When you build a taxonomy, you define every single term. The differences in data science, usually you have aliases, and in software engineering. Within taxonomy, you have what's called alt labels, same as alias, but your alt labels, meaning, I don't know, if you have Amazon product, Amazon Web Services, an alt label would be AWS, right? But that AWS is not going to exist in the main corpus in the taxonomy. Its purpose is as an alt label, and that helps with findability and discovery and information retrieval for humans and machines. Two separate tasks: human information retrieval and then machine.
And so at that point, are we almost combining like a hierarchical taxonomy with more of a tagging approach? Is that one way to think of this?
One can take that approach.
Okay.
Tagging,
She's kind of cringing right now, Matt. So
Yeah, I can
let's
see that.
tell us
Okay,
more, Jessica.
tagging, to me, it's great. I mean, you can have a tagging taxonomy. That's perfect. That's fine. But tagging, if you simply apply tags in a very flat way, like if the taxonomy has this beautiful shape and then it goes into Postgres, and then all of a sudden you break it apart, you flatten it out, and you just have like a word cloud or tags, then you don't have inheritance. And how are you able to enable inference if your information, your data, is not contextualized? Right? So a tag is flatter. Often tags lose their inheritance, where, cloud computing, underneath cloud computing might be a concept like, I don't know, cloud architecture, right? If you flatten it out and they're adjacent to one another in a tagging scenario, then you lose the relationship that would be the basis for a recommender system, because cloud architecture is nested underneath cloud computing. So
Yes, this totally makes
yeah.
sense.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense? Okay.
Oh, no, it absolutely does.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Yeah.
I guess the bigger point here is that it seems like it was almost 20 years ago, there was this big movement in computer science toward more of a tagging based approach and less of a hierarchical approach, which you're probably extremely familiar with. And yeah, the problem is that so many things do fit naturally into an inherited hierarchy.
And I mean, when we have inference models, what are they trying to do?
Basically
They're
classify things, but in a fine grained fashion, typically.
and be able to tell you what things it's related to. So if you already have a taxonomy, think of how much more powerful recommender systems, inference models, even like if your business or if you're training models or you're creating a knowledge graph and you want NLP, taxonomy certainly would help.
Interesting. Tell us more about that, because NLP's, it's been around for a while. It's widely used. How does NLP fit in with taxonomy?
Should I mention Word2Vec? Is that pretty
Sure.
familiar for most people? Sure. Okay. So that is very closely tied to the information science, library science world. That whole, the WordNet, which is Princeton University's, if you're to pull that in as your NLP at base, which defines terms and their relationships and what have you. When I build taxonomies, I rarely do it in a spreadsheet. I usually use either OpenRefine, which is a free tool. It's awesome if you haven't checked it out. And the reason for aligning your taxonomy, you link with HTTP URIs, IRIs that connect to meta records. And those meta records have like pages of links within that is its own taxonomy. So not only are you defining every term, but you're linking that term to a meta record that's filled with all of this rich information that relates to that term. So in the case of NLP, you can create really robust knowledge bases and corpuses from building a taxonomy correctly and then extracting using those URIs. You pull from those meta records and you're able to identify more quickly. It's a more rapid and I would say more timely approach. You're going to have better data quality. You're not going to have as much noise when you have your taxonomy well defined. It's actually a definition. All labels. You have a defined hierarchy. So you have your relationships, contextualization, and then you have the IRIs or URIs. Hopefully that's not too complex.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I was just thinking of like
Yeah.
the latest rage right now, which is Stable Diffusion. You're able to
Mhm.
type in some stuff and you can generate images like that. Um, that's fascinating in itself, and it seems like I'd be very curious about the how taxonomy plays into that. I don't know if you've dug into the source code of Stable Diffusion lately, but just kidding. but
Yeah.
but it's really fascinating. But yeah, I remember when Word Dev came out too. That was definitely I think a bit of a lifesaver for a lot of data scientists.
Yeah.
Until then, it was I think you were using a lot of more classical kind of ML and frankly text techniques to to kind of pattern match words and stuff. And it was
Exactly.
kind of hit and miss. It's really complex. Got a question here from Guy again. Hi, Guy. Would medical terms be a good example of a well-defined industry professional standard taxonomy? He also
Yes.
comments, funny how it's based in Latin. So,
Oh yeah. And that's a specific, like within taxonomy, you're working with a lexicon, which I think is a word that's misappropriated or misused. What is it? A malapropism? I love that word, malapropism. When you
It's a
were,
great word. Yeah.
it is, right?
It feels awkward,
Uh,
just like the concept. Yeah.
yeah. There's a great, like, what is it, 17th century play, The Malapropisms, if you haven't. A side, a little
We'll look
side.
it up. Yeah.
But yeah, so if you have Latin terms, there would be what translates, and this is done with like NIH. NIH, National Institute of Health, has a published taxonomy with ontology, and you can download it and you can pull it in. It's a TTL file, or you can download it as JSON, a number of different formats. And those, like I cited before, you can orient it. So say the alt label is the Latin term, but the English label is what's known commonly, like if you went to WebMD or you were being your own doctor online and looking on the front end. You want both to exist, but incorporating the lexicon that's specific to medicine is really important. And actually, there's a great need for taxonomists within that space, like people who can classify organisms, because we haven't had enough people trained to maintain the bio. There's more people in the biomedical space, but when you get towards that animal kingdom, like for example, and this is great, bees in California, or certain honeybees, are endangered. This is more recent news. In order to protect them, bees were reclassified as fish in California in order for them to guarantee protection status for these certain bees. And I think, and I may be wrong, so someone correct me, I think that the classification came down to attributes. I think because bees have shells, or there's something that makes them similar to fish, they found some connection, and that is what was able to give bees that specific protection status in California.
All right.
So it becomes important with policy, and it becomes important to represent the lexicon and to retain that knowledge that's so essential that doctors and researchers understand. And for you to be able to render the human friendly label for those that don't know Latin.
Matt, do you know Latin? You seem like the kind of guy that would know Latin.
No, I don't. I really don't know any Latin. It seems
No.
incredibly hard.
Okay, well, you can leave the show now. So just kidding.
Yeah.
Jessica, do you know some Latin? Okay, they don't force you to learn it. No, but I mean, if we think about the way the language works, yeah, I mean, often as we write sentences, we're either classifying things in terms of hierarchy when we use terms, or we're applying attributes, or maybe we're tagging to some extent. And so when we think about a legal document, how we legally define a species, for example, this does become really, really critical.
Yeah.
The green taxonomy is a great example, because like corporations are going to be able to qualify and get scores for how green they are, going towards the EU's initiative towards zero waste.
Interesting.
So you have a lead building, and you get ding 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 points, and it maps to values that are help to define and score businesses.
How does the way that we communicate translate into a taxonomy? Right now, I would say, especially with the advent of the internet a while back, and
Mhm.
mobile right now, this is it feels like language is changing. Does this impact taxonomies at all?
Yes and no, but and that's something that that's an interesting question because if something's known and there's a slang term or an acronym or there's other way that most people identify this term, there's always the choice, is that an alt label or an alias
Mm,
for the actual term? But you do want to represent all of the manifestations of that one term or label, including like street name for something. Like Urban Dictionary is a great example.
Urban Dictionary is awesome, by the way. So
Isn't it great? That's taxonomy. They have taxonomy within Urban Dictionary.
that'd be a fun job, actually. So
I would love to work with Urban Dictionary. That would be very cool.
if Urban Dictionary is hiring right now, just kidding. So,
Reach out, reach out.
yeah, reach out.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting because it seems like I mean, I got kids, and they say just the way they communicate is just different than how I communicated, and probably all of us communicated back when we were kids, and it just seems, and even with texting, right? Like that's another one where that you know emojis. I'll ask this: do emojis have a taxonomy?
Yes,
Or
they do.
okay,
Oh wow. Okay.
Yes. Emojis have a taxonomy. They're controlled. You know when the new emoji comes out and it's like, oh, there's a new set of emojis. Imagine the approval processes, the taxonomy work that goes into that. Um, it's important because otherwise, imagine if there were no controlled vocabularies and you had emojis that, if you think of like the emojis that are in Teams
mm,
and you look at the emojis that are in like the Apple UI, a little different.
true.
Imagine if those existed together side by side, it'd be a nightmare.
Mm. Yeah, because I'll get some
At least to
texts that are
me.
all emojis. Yeah, like I'm sure
All
all of us
emojis.
get. Yeah, we just. I mean,
And
I that's how I communicate.
that's like a totally geeky, like personal love because I have a background. I was the art college librarian for a couple years, and I worked on this large project called, it was Twinkativo, so it was an exhibit that was at the Crocker Museum. So I have this other love for art and the organization and classification in that world.
Interesting.
And pictures are so important, and there's ISO standards. If you think of Europe, Matt, you're in Europe right now,
Yes. Lots of
and
art
there's
museums.
right, lots of art museums, and there's also standardization throughout Europe of road signs, and that blends into human factors. So it's like the idea that a picture, what is it? A picture speaks 1,000 words, or whatever it is. Our ability to understand pictures or pictograms, we call them icons in the US, but pictograms, there's ISO standards like fire, radiation, like those are actually organized and classified. There's a classification system
Interesting.
for those.
Well, and if you look at European appliances, so American appliances, we have some pictograms, but they have a lot of English on there. And quite often, European appliances sold in the EU have almost no language on them because they assume that people could be speaking 20 different languages. So instead, they'll have the pictograms, and then there's a manual that tells you what those pictograms mean in your language, be it
Think of
Polish or
building
French or, yeah,
IKEA furniture.
Mhm.
exactly.
Yep.
Yes.
That's intense. But you're if you get a bunch of IKEA furniture that you have to put together, I'm just going to give you a little hint. If you go through IKEA through the exit, don't go through. Go to the as is, where people have already built things.
Mm,
Yeah.
Yes.
that's a good idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But it is complex for a lot of people. Very.
Oh, that's why there's professional IKEA furniture assemblers. Yeah, you can hire them. That's interesting. I remember in the UK too, and I saw this in Australia. I don't know if it's just particularly the British roads that drive on the left, but they have these squiggly lines, which I never saw before. I was like, are you supposed to like swerve in these? It looks like kind of the interstate over by Lehigh, but but it's towards a stop sign. I guess it was kind of more like you're supposed to not actually slow down or something like that. But it was weird. Yeah, but it's like, okay, I've never seen this before. I wouldn't know what to do if I were driving on this thing. So, but it's a good example too of just, but I'm sure there's a taxonomy for that somewhere where, it's like a safety or road marks or something like that. Like,
And what's really strange to me is, and this is, I noticed these, like, if you have a speed bump,
mhm.
I was in Hawaii and it's called a speed table.
Huh.
And it can be called, there's one other word that I've seen used for that, but there are 3 different words that are used that I know of in the US to identify one thing.
Interesting.
So you start to get different symbols and meanings, and those symbols are critical because we're living more and more in this world that's sort of organized by symbols for efficiency and speed.
Mhm.
Now, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and for those familiar with Washington, D.C., there are signs because they switched the traffic there. Have you guys been to D.C.
Mhm.
before? Traffic there's nuts.
Yep.
Yeah.
So they have times like 4 p.m. All of a sudden, this road that's 6 or 7 or 8 lanes across turns into one lane going in one direction, and then like 6 lanes going in the other. And then at 8 in the morning, it flips. So if you're driving during that change and you're going head on with another car, the problem is the signs are so literal and long, they take up a whole street lamp. Does anyone have time to like read through all of that?
Right. That's an interesting point. I mean, so with taxonomies, how much does that intersect with stuff like user experience, for example?
Enormously. User experience, oftentimes some of the research methodologies like card sorting, tree testing are similar. That's same with product design. And then also you have heuristic evaluation. And when you're looking at how a user interacts and you're building, for example, a taxonomy to be ingested for Solr or for Elasticsearch, it means something. You have usually a display index, and that represents how you want the labels and everything to be organized and display on the front end. And then you have a non-display index, which might be more complete. And the two speak to each other to pull data because you don't want to load. Think of a user experience that you love and think of a user experience you hate.
Mm.
There's 2 different behaviors. So if you think of UI or UX and you want you have a browse experience and then you have a search experience. They're 2 different experiences or 2 different functions on the front end. Is a hierarchy important on the front end? Do you want users to be able to start from large terms and then be able to drill down? Or are you going to load the front end with a bunch of ML and AI? Have 5, 10 experiments running at the same time, cross your fingers, have a whole allow and deny list that you upload that, from a CSV and just hope that things turn out and that users have a great experience? Or do you want a clean structure, fuzzy matching, and allow users to drive their own experience because you have such great, clean taxonomy that it's easier. These tools are purpose built to index and to help to organize information on the front end to drive a meaningful user experience. If you start to implement and introduce too much noise, then you might kill your user experience.
Mm.
And it's super important that that UX and UI folk, design, product, work closely together with taxonomists. Everyone tries to put taxonomy or taxonomists or information science folk like into some sort of box. And like within the organization, do you sit with tech? Do you sit with product? Do you sit with design?
Mm.
And it's a tricky one because it kind of serves multiple areas of the business.
But I mean, ultimately, I would want my taxonomists working with my data engineers and with my data scientists. I mean, my very general anecdotal observation is that data scientists are the most successful when they really work closely with domain experts, and that can be taxonomists depending on what the domain is, right? Uh, And that comes back to that hubris. I mean, if you have too much hubris, either on the taxonomy side or on the data engineering side or on the data science side, then you're just off there basically reinventing the wheel instead of figuring out how you can improve what's already been done.
Well, and I feel like most taxonomists or people in the field want so badly to work with data scientists. It's sort of
Yeah.
like being included in a club. Because together, one, I don't see as being able to work separately from the other entirely in this effort to, especially because ML and AI is such a huge focus in most businesses, and that's what we're placing all our bets on to drive value. And it's like we can each bring our own skill sets to the table, and it's sort of the convergence of both of those things. Like, yeah, you hit the relational databases, you do the SQL, I'll deal with the SCOS, the JSON, the serial. There's two different representations of the data, and when you align those two, super powerful. So it's not one or the other.
I guess for taxonomy ignoramuses like Matt and I, what are some materials you would suggest for us to at least get up to speed on the basics? Are there books, videos, courses? What would
There
you
are
suggest?
some great books. Most people know Accidental Taxonomist by Heather Hedden, and relate to that very much. There's some pretty relatable books out there that help give you sort of a ground floor understanding of taxonomy. There's also ones that go into more DAM, so digital asset management systems. So Metadata Matters is a newer book, which I think is helpful for people working in that environment. And I know that like once you start to get into the world of ontology, it gets a little, there's a whole MIT, those little mini books, the series. That little mini book series is great because it has information metadata management. And I think together, collectively, those books as a series, I mean, they're like this big, maybe like 60, 70 pages, look good on a coffee table. And then the ONZZ, this is the this is something that I'm currently dealing with is, taxonomy is very standards based. I don't know if you guys realize that most of the taxonomy terms that exist in federal information structures, with the inception of the internet and with the help of DARPA, a project was started called Project Open Data that's still alive today. And it is sort of the OG of data observability quality metrics. They actually have a dashboard if you go to I think it's data.gov. And you can see how they rate data quality. Everyone has to submit it. There's transformers, there's crosswalks, it's everything you want that's in there. And if you go to data.gov and you start to look at the shape of the data quality dashboard, all of the terms within taxonomies that really are public facing and help to govern and align and help to enforce quality and consistency and reliability and all of those things have to be voted on by Congress. Not all of them, but most of them. So there's a big fight from the library community, the American Library Association, where year after year they were going back to Congress and proposing that illegal alien, that term, be changed to migrant worker, like represent actually several different terms. Because if you think of going into a library, illegal alien, if those are, have their own serialized codes on a shelf within a classification and cataloging system, mighty confusing, and it's also slightly offensive.
Right.
ALA finally prevailed and they got the term changed. So words really matter in that situation. They can be politicized quite a bit. And information can be very politicized and biased to that end. So there's a standard called the ONZZ 39 standard, which is for the management of monolingual vocabularies, taxonomies, thesauri. And if you haven't read it, it's not light reading, but if you really want to understand it, I really believe, and with any team that I sit on, you should have this in your back pocket, the ANSI Z39 standard, because that really is the foundation of how information is organized on the internet. And we can have renegades. Like, a lot of people will tell me I'm a purist, and that's okay, because at the end of the day, you're looking out for the best interest of your business, right? So if we say, oh, standards don't matter, frameworks, ISOs don't matter, well, do they? Like, if you have user data and you're about to go live with something and you're not following GDPR, no, that's no fun.
No, not at all. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, increasingly, to your point, GDPR has become a data engineering and data science responsibility, right? And the reality is that you probably need other people assisting in these efforts. I mean, to actually understand how to classify data who are specialists in that domain. Yeah.
Yeah. And the same for like ADA compliance. So accessibility, it's no different. So whether we realize it or not, we're constantly, you know, you're putting your best face forward, whether you do B2B, B2C, if it's just even internal. And it would be awful if something happened and you didn't have the correct protections around your data. It could be catastrophic.
It'd be really bad.
It'd be really bad. Yeah. So it's sort of, I think of it as being like beyond, and this sounds really lofty, but there is the idea that we all have to be really good data citizens. I know that it's altruistic, but I do have a belief in that, because ultimately, if you just organize a bunch of terms and there's repetition, duplication, you have every single iteration of a term. So you might have the past tense, the future, the ing, the plural, and that's all sitting alongside each other in a taxonomy. Well, you're creating duplicates, and you're creating a lot of noise. So the cleaner your data, because we always talk about data cleaning. My understanding was always, before I entered the field, that, oh, that's data engineer's job to clean data. But I'm not sure that we all do it.
Well, and in addition, I would say to a substantial degree, it's the domain experts who understand what clean data even is. Again, data engineers often are responsible for implementing tools to clean the data and pipelines. But like, someone has to point out the data quality problems in the first place. And before you can even point them out, like, someone has to decide what clean data is. Ideally not through central committee like the old days, the dark days, the 80s and 90s, but through some kind of collaborative process.
Yeah, I mean, we call it data management, data governance, some of the undercurrents of data engineering, but it's more to the point that you need to be aware of these things. But it's not like you need to develop an expertise. I mean, you have extensive training and experience in taxonomies, for example. I wouldn't expect a data engineer to be able to like put together an entire stack, architect it, plus do the taxonomy. That would be pretty cool, but probably a lot to expect from somebody.
So. There's something pretty cool that I've been thinking about lately in the library space, which is you could be a cataloger. That could be your job. You could work in records. You could work in, like, for any sort of organization, archives, or even just as a librarian. And so when you catalog a book, it goes into a format. It's a bibliographic record, and it's encoded. It's called MARC, M-A-R-C, and RDA is the encoding structure. And so it's pretty intense, a bibliographic record, if you ever get a chance to look at one, because you're identifying in fields every single aspect about a book. But there's this beautiful thing called copy cataloging. So once you create a record, I can go into OCLC, which is like the central worldwide cataloging interface or repository. And I get a new book into my library, and I can just copy catalog it. And there's risk in that because it can become viral because if something's misclassified, meaning that a book's supposed to be a graphic novel, but it's put into spirituality or religion, and that's been copy cataloged so many times, then you're adopting, without thinking about it, someone else's take or opinion or bias about that object.
Mm.
So there are problems, but I've been thinking about copy cataloging and that idea in digital twins, in data management within an organization. The value of creating, where something can be reusable.
Yeah.
But
It's really
if that
interesting.
reusable, yeah, because bias is, I think, how do we remove bias? I don't know. We're
Yeah,
humans.
because well, that's one problem we've seen with data science. I mean, a lot of the work of data science is just to automate things that humans were doing before. And what ends up happening is we end up propagating existing human biases from the data that we're training from.
And it's becoming like the ethics of ML and
Yes.
AI is becoming very apparent because I think there's something really sexy about a black box. Like, I don't understand this thing, but it's magical.
Yes.
Look at, yeah. And so we just put so much trust in it. And then when we start to realize, or someone, a person, a good citizen, exposes the biases that are included in that algorithm. I mean, this is happening right now with people's credit scores.
Mm.
That the use of algorithms, that there are biases. Did you go to college? Like the information and data they have on you, unknowing, you don't know it, but it's actually applying biases and then actually affecting your public reputation score, your credit score.
And you even have, even though it's been illegal to use, say, racial information in making credit decisions for a long, long time, you get this indirect bias effect where other pieces of data might hint about your background, where you grew up, and that then is used as a bias against you. And so you have indirect racial and ethnic biases showing up in data. It's a huge, huge problem, and it's one that we think we've made a lot more progress than we actually have in these areas.
Yeah, and the governance around that, like how we check ourselves for biases. It's hard because how can we be completely just objective? I don't know if humans can be. And then the models, how do we introduce and create sort of checks and balances
Mm-hmm.
to help to identify those biases? I
Well,
think
yes.
that's the first step.
Well, for sure. Now, I was talking with a friend of mine about this over the weekend. We were on a walk, and we are talking about a kind of system one and system two thinking. And sort of system one thinking is when you're just reacting off of instinct and emotion, but that tends to be kind of the default for most people. System two is very much take some time, think about it, which isn't the default. That requires time and thought and hard work and stuff. So, but yeah, it is fascinating. I don't have an answer to it. I'm not an expert in ethics or bias. Lord knows I probably have tons of my own. I'm sure we all do. So it's
We all do.
but how do you standardize that, right? That's the big question. And then again, the question I always have is, well, whose ethics, right? The same questions that, or the same ethics that you would have here probably don't apply in China. Just saying. So
Yeah.
right.
I mean,
So,
China, if you don't let your children watch TikTok, then, that you have to wonder.
yeah.
You're not allowed to watch TikTok during the school week in
Right.
China,
Play video games.
right?
And
So,
all the others.
mhm,
Yep.
mhm.
Yeah, whereas here, my kids playing video games all the time. He's playing Minecraft. So I mean, to me, Minecraft is just Legos for like the modern age. But it's no different. But over there, it's like you couldn't play video games even. So it's just
It's a really hard. And actually, another on that note, sort of somewhat related, because I know Minecraft has a great taxonomy.
Interesting.
And because think of how many objects when you introduce like a new,
Yes.
oh my gosh, it's kind of a complex game.
Oh, it's very complex.
Yeah.
Seems simple till you, yeah. There's a lot going on there. That's really interesting. Well, cool. Coming up on time. Thanks for having, thanks for being on the show. I think I
Thanks,
learned
Chris.
a ton of stuff that I just, frankly, stuff that I just never, I don't even know the questions to ask half the time
Well,
about
that's
this
just
stuff.
it. Mostly, I have more questions now, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, same. We can go on forever.
Good.
I gotta
We
get
can
to
go
another.
on forever.
Yeah, that's awesome. For people who want to learn more about you, how can they do that?
You can hit me up on LinkedIn
Cool.
um and just stay in touch, and I'm actually coming out with some content that I am creating, so I'm going to be writing
Nice.
and my email.
Cool.
So happy to share.
Awesome.
Hmm.
Sounds good. Right. Well, cool. Next week we have Sonny Rivera. He's from ThoughtSpot. We're gonna be talking about BI and all that fun stuff. So, and then who else do we have? Super organized today. Christian Call actually on November 7th. We're gonna be talking about data modeling. He's a this would be a really fun conversation. So yeah, lots of favorites. Yeah, but I think a lot of good response to your our discussion as well. So I think you
Thank
struck
you,
a nerve,
Chris.
Jessica. So
Hopefully it's just conversation. I just want to have dialogue and conversation.
that's all it's about. So
Yes, exactly.
cool. All
All
right.
right.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you.
everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.